Hi, my name is James. Welcome to King's Fine Woodworking. Today I'm going to show you how to build this daybed. We made this out of solid walnut with African Blackwood accents. So it's a pretty quick project, but it's a little bit longer video because I want to show you in detail how it's made. First, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's helped make the channel what it is today. And I want to let you know that our Father's Day sale has been extended to the end of the month. We had about 3 dozen emails that came in right at the end of the sale asking us if there's any way we could extend the sale a little bit longer. They just didn't have a chance to pick one up, and so we thought we'd go ahead and run the sale until the end of the month. So the opportunity is still open to pick up one of our signature Thor's Hammer woodworking mallets made of exotic woods from around the world for half price. There's a link in the description below that tells you just how to do that. Thanks again, everyone. Okay, so getting back to the project, we started this whole thing with some 12-quarter rough walnut. In fact, all of this project was built with rough lumber, so the first thing we had to do was take the time to mill it down. Now, if you don't have a jointer and a planer, you could certainly buy your lumber that's already been planed from your local hardwood dealer. Or better yet, I designed this bed so that it can be made really easily from 4x4s from your local big box home improvement store. But if you do get it rough, the first thing to do for a project like this is to surface one face. We got to get this one face completely flat and get rid of all those rough saw marks. You see, after the first pass, it's still not flat enough, and so we've got to send it through here for another pass or two to get this side flat before we can proceed. Once we've decided that we have one face nice and flat, and I'm actually going to get rid of the defects on that edge there, the next step is to put that flat face against our fence. Make sure our fence is at 90 degrees on the jointer, and I want to go ahead and square up one edge. At that point, oftentimes I'll just take it right over to the table saw. I'll put the flat side down and the square edge against my fence, and I'll rip out one of the lengths of the pieces that I need here. Now, the main reason I came directly to the table saw as opposed to going over to the planer after the jointer was because I want these squares to be as big as I can get them. So I don't want to do a lot of milling only to come back and cut and then have to go back and do some milling again. So once I have two sides that are flat and square, I can go right to the table saw. I can cut it to the biggest square that I can achieve, and then from there we'll take it over to the planer. Here, of course, I'm just going to do a series of passes through the planer. I'm going to start with the roughest side first, and then make sure I always hit one of the two faces that's complementary or 90 degrees to that. And work it down until all sides are smooth, but I have the biggest possible square that's left over. For 12-quarter stock, it starts at 3 inches rough. If the wood's not too bad and I've maximized my yield, I can usually end up with like 3 3/4 inch squares. And unfortunately, these were quite a bit rougher than a lot of the stuff that we deal with, and so we ended up with about 3.5 inches, which still isn't too bad. And it turned out when the project was all over, I think that 3.5 ended up looking great, which actually gave me the idea that you can very easily make a daybed like this, or any sort of a bed frame like this, with 4x4s from the big box store. Many years ago, I used to do a lot of woodworking, buying lumber, say southern yellow pine or Douglas fir or regular pine or hem fir, by getting it from the big box store. It's an economical way to go, and you can have some really nice, really useful projects for your home that way. Once those pieces have been milled down, then I'll just take all of these lengths over to my chop saw, and I will chop them all to the required length for the project at this point. Once those pieces have been milled down, then I'll just take all of these lengths over to my chop saw, and I will chop them all to the required length for the project at this point. So we've decided we're going to put this together with mortise and tenon joinery, and the first step for us when we do that is to lay out all of the joints. I like to use double squares for that, and I can simply set the ruler back a specified distance from the edge of the square, and it's very easy just to trace out the location of where I'm going to put the mortises. When it comes to actually putting the mortises in or cutting the mortises in, they can easily be cut by hand if that's the sort of thing that you like to do. I, on the other hand, like to use a machine for as much as I can. I'm really a machine tool woodworker. And so I have a jig that I will create typically for every mortise that I do. It's a jig I can make in about 5 minutes, and I've got a video showing you exactly how I make it. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll put a link to that in the description below. Next, I'll just slide this jig in place. It's going to go directly over the mortise that I'm cutting here. And I will clamp this down. The way this jig is made is it's just designed to be held with a single clamp at this point. It'll be held pretty snugly. And I often put pieces like this on my assembly table in the vise in order to do the work. That makes it pretty simple. And if you have an assembly table like this, great. If not, I have a video on how to make one of those too. So once that's all set up, I just use a plunge router, and I use a spiral bit in order to make the plunge. I'm using a spiral up and down combination cutter here. It's a little more expensive than a traditional router bit, straight cutting router bit, just because it's solid carbide and it's an up and down cutter. But when you get into a bigger bit, a little more expensive bit like this, they'll really hog through a lot of material very fast. And so there's some advantages to it in that you can cut mortises very, very quickly. With these, you can certainly cut mortises with just about any straight cutting bit. Something like this just makes it quicker. So I've got to make this mortise fairly deep, and as you can see, the template here is preventing me from going as deep as this router might potentially be able to reach. I'm also doing it in multiple passes, so I don't try to take off too much at one time, which would make it difficult for the router, and even for a bit this size. But since my cutter is a straight cutter and also a flush trim bit, it's pretty simple to go deeper. I can just take the jig off at this point, and now this portion of the mortise has been established, and I can just plunge the router in, and as long as my first cut, I get it down inside of the material just a little bit lower than it is now, such that the bearing can ride on my inner surface of the pre-existing mortise, then I can go considerably deeper. I hope that all made sense. So at this point, basically, I am riding on the inner surface of the existing mortise with the bearing, and I can plunge 2 or 3 levels deeper at this point and get that mortise just as deep as I want. And you can see that just cuts a perfectly clean, very neat mortise. And here's a close-up of that router bit, and I'll put a link to that in the description also. I like to take a moment and set up all of the legs and the orientation they're going to go in, and just quickly note exactly where each mortise is supposed to go. Since this bed does have a front and a back and a left and a right, it's important to make a real quick rough mark so I don't make any mistakes when putting these mortises in. Once the mortises are done, I'll turn my attention to the tenons, and this is just a little sample block of the 3.5 inch by 3.5 inch squares that I'm using to build the bed with. And I'll just make a little note here on the edge of the wood. That's going to be a tenon. Of course, it's just drawn roughly there, and it's going to fit into this point like that. So this is step by step how I would do the layout for the tenon. I'll get my double square set up, make sure that the ruler is loose. I'll put it along this edge, and I'll slide the ruler forward until it's perfectly flush with the edge of the mortise. Once that's done, I can lock that in place, and I'll double check it again, make sure that's right, and make sure it's the same on the other side. In this case it is, because I made sure the mortise was centered, and then I can transfer those marks over to my tenon, or my board where my tenon's going to be. And I'll mark that on both sides. I'll mark it in a couple of places, and then I'll just use the longer side of this double square, keeping it square to the top there, and I'll get a layout line here of where the edges of this tenon are. These are going to end up being the cheeks of the tenon. These are the cheek cuts. And then I'm going to need to know, how deep does this tenon go in? So I'll use the same thing here, same principle here. I'm going to use my longer double square. I'll get the ruler loose on it, and I'll put the ruler in until it bottoms out. And right there we can see it's hit the bottom, and then I can go ahead and lock it down. And then I will transfer that to my board where the tenon goes. And the same thing here, I'll make a little mark, and then I'm just going to draw a line all the way across. And this line at the top and the bottom there, those are going to represent the shoulder cuts. So that's the maximum depth that the tenon will go to. Now I can take this sample board here over to my table saw sled. This sled, I've designed it to cut dados on, and since it's a dado cutter, I have a zero clearance replaceable insert, so it's perfect for cutting dados, which means it's perfect for cutting tenons. If you don't have a table saw sled that can do this, you might consider building one. I'm going to put a link to this video in my description below as well, so you can check it out in case you need to get a sled like this. It's so easy, it takes 5 minutes to make a perfect tenon using a sled like this. So I set the depth there just a moment ago, and now I'm going to set the edge. So the very edge of the shoulder cut there is going to line up with the edge of where my table saw blade comes up through the sled. And that's how I know where the edge is, and I'm just going to put a little stop block in place so I know to cut over to that point. And I've got the blade raised up to the correct height, the height where the cheek is, and that's all there is to it. So at that point, we'll just, after I've done a test cut, which I generally recommend, although I don't always do myself, we can go ahead and cut one. So this first cut is defining the shoulder cut on the right and the cheek cut on the top. And then we'll just slide the board over a little bit and make a second cut. And we'll slide the board over a little bit more to finalize this edge of the tenon. And it's that easy to make perfect tenons on the table saw sled. All we have to do is flip the board over, and we can cut the other side of the tenon using the exact same procedure. This table saw sled also happens to be just a traditional crosscut sled. We swap out the zero clearance insert there, put a regular blade in, and it acts like any crosscut sled. But it has a lot of extra value when it can do dados and tenons as well. Once we have those cut on one side of the board, we can flip the board over and do the same series of cuts on the other side of the board. A sled like this will also work for dados or tenons on the end of very long boards. Sometimes you'll need somebody helping you out with a hand way out on the outboard side of it, or you could even set up a roller or some sort of a guide system. And my daughter Maya here is cutting the tenon while Kyle is holding the board on the left. Next we had to change the depth out to get the tops and bottoms of these tenons cut, because the cheeks are in a little bit different position than they were when they were on the side. And that just takes a moment to change the depth on the saw, and we'll go through the same series of cuts here. And that actually will complete the tenon for the end of the board. This is a friend of mine. His name is Fielding. He actually used to be an electrical inspector and did the inspection for our workshop, and he's become a woodworker. So he came over today to give us a hand, and this is the first time that he's ever cut a tenon, I believe, and so we're helping him learn some new woodworking skills here, and he's having a blast. And it turns out he ended up being remarkably good at this and helping us fine-tune the tenon fits later. I think because he had some just previous hand tool experience and he'd been using tools his whole life, I think woodworking is coming naturally to him. So no doubt everybody's out there wondering how I'm going to fit this square tenon into that round mortise, and I'll tell you. There are two ways to do it. One is I can use a chisel and I can square up the mortise, or I can use files and a rasp and I can round over the tenon. And I do both about equally, but I'll tell you what the deciding factor is for us. If it is a deep mortise and the tenon is of pretty good size and the tenon is rectangular rather than square, I find it much easier just to round over the tenon, and I don't have to worry about the tenon rolling around if it's rectangular rather than square. And so that's the route I go there. If the mortise ends up being fairly shallow, or if the tenon is a little more squarish in shape, then traditionally I'll go ahead and square up the mortise. It's pretty quick to file down the tenon to make it round to fit into the mortise. It probably just takes us a minute or two, but oftentimes we'll have to follow up with some shoulder plane or a block plane in the event that I did not cut the shoulders of the tenon very well. And that's pretty straightforward. I'll just put whatever I'm working with inside of my vise, and I'll just use a shoulder plane is what I'll start with. If that doesn't work, I can go to the block plane, but it just takes a moment or two to square this up, and I'll show you the results of that here. And I don't know if you can notice, but I basically have that cut all the way down. It looks a little different, I think, just because it's been planed, but now these two edges are perfectly flat, and over there those meet as well. So sometimes you need a little bit of handwork no matter what you do. And there's Fielding again, and he did a really good job of hand fitting some tenons himself today too. So one final detail is that many of these tenons are meeting on one side of the frame with another tenon meeting exactly opposite of it. So I've got to chop the corners of these guys off in order to have a nice fit inside of the post. And basically I'll hold the other one up next to it here and get an idea of where I need to cut that 45. And I'll do that so these fit snugly. And then lastly, sometimes I will trim about a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch off the very end of the tenon so that it can fit inside of the mortise without bottoming out. I'll usually measure it to fit perfectly, but I'll come back and trim just a tiny bit off of the end of the tenon. And after that, we'll proceed to a dry fit. At this point, I'm looking for a fit that is just very lightly snug because I'm going to put glue in there, which occupies space and it swells up the wood a little bit. So if I have to hammer too hard to put the tenon in, that means the tenon's just too tight. So I'm kind of looking for a loose fit at this point, but at the same time, I don't want anything that's going to wiggle around. So we just assembled the right side leg part of the bed, and here we're assembling the left side leg part of the bed, and we're going to clamp them together. This is still just kind of a dry run, a dry fit to make sure everything comes together like it should, and I don't have to fix anything before moving on. And I think most of you recognize my daughter Maya in the green shirt there, who helps us on just about every project. And of course there's Sai, our resident photobomber. And my other daughter, who's on the left now, her name is Kavita, and we call her Kavi. But she is, I think she got bored and kind of sad that we're woodworking all the time and she doesn't get to, so she's probably going to be in a lot more videos from this point forward. So it's kind of cool. We got 3 of our daughters now who are coming to the shop all the time to help out. I actually have 2 more daughters, and we'll probably see them from time to time too. So far the dry fit's going pretty good. Got one more board to get in there. And this is a reason why you should have a long pipe clamp in your arsenal, or actually a pair. A single clamp doesn't often do you much good. You usually have to have things in pairs, but we actually keep 4 10-foot long pipe clamps just for really long glue ups like this. Might only need them, 2 times a year, but when you need them, they're invaluable. And I think that completes the clamping of this project, and it looks like everything has come together well on it. Yep, I was wrong. One more pipe clamp there. All right, so that's it. Looks like all the dry fit came together really well. So what I like to do now is quickly mark all the pieces. They should theoretically be interchangeable from different areas to different areas, but just in case, we got a perfect dry fit here. So I'm going to mark each piece before I disassemble it and proceed with the work. If you recall from the picture, this bed is accented with African Blackwood. And this is a piece of African Blackwood that we got for another project. This was the piece I had left over. This is a pretty rare and pretty expensive piece of rosewood. It's a true rosewood, and it's kind of hard to get a hold of. So whenever I order some for a project, I tried to order just a tiny bit more than what I need, so I have some little scraps left over to do stuff with. And so what we're doing is Maya's resawing this down here in order to cut it down to the pieces that we need, the sizes that we need for this project. And that's it. There's a lot of defects, a lot of cracks, a lot of checks. It's a really rare species. So finding any of this in absolutely perfect condition that has any size to it is pretty hard to do. So once she's got the resaw done, she's got to go over to the planer and get everything planed down to be completely flat. And we're going to have pieces of two different thicknesses. I'm going to put sort of a sock or a footer at the base. And there they are, all cut down and all planed down for us. It's such a beautiful wood. We're going to put that sock around the base, and I'm going to put a little 1/4 inch thick piece on the cap to make a little cap on top of each of the 4 posts. And you'll see how we put those together here. For me to get the footer part, the sock part that goes around the bottom of each of these legs, I've got to take it back over to my table saw sled, set my dado blade up. I'm setting up about 1/8 of an inch deep all the way around. If you saw from the picture, we had this around the bottom. Some people actually came to me and thought that the whole bottom was a piece of African blackwood. Of course, that would be far too expensive, so these are just 1/8 inch pieces that we've joined around the bottom. So we'll get one side in, I'll rotate that 90 degrees, and we'll dado it out again. And we'll just do that on all 4 edges until we have this thing completely dadoed out and ready to glue the African blackwood onto it. So next I'll need to cut these down to size. I'll just go to the chop saw for that, and we'll cut them just a little bit oversized in order for trimming them at a later point. You see I've kind of marked them out with a pencil where I want them cut. You can't see it, I guess, they're that well on camera though. And that's how that's going to fit in there. We're going to basically make them overlap. I'm going to line up flush to one edge and overlap the other. African blackwood is an oily wood, so before I can put any sort of glue on these, I need to get most of the oil off the surface. Acetone is really the only way to do this. Acetone is a very powerful solvent that will dissolve the oil from just about any wood. So I'll acetone the surface off, and before it sits for too long, which would allow oils to come back to the surface, I need to go ahead and glue it on. I'm going to do this with CA glue. CA glue is a very high strength glue, and for an application like this, it's perfect because it's instant. And I've got so many glue ups. I've got 4 legs, 4 pieces per leg, so 16 glue ups. I don't want to spend a long time doing this glue ups, all of these glue ups, so I'm going to use CA glue for it. And I basically just going to keep going right around the circle like this. I'm using this piece here to align the top piece up to the edge. You can see how that works there. And so I'm going to get the glue in, and I'll walk you through it one more time. I want to make sure I get glue on the edges too to bond the 2 pieces of blackwood together. And I want some glue up on the shoulder of that tenon, because I guess that's a sort of a tenon. And I'll set it down there, and I'll push this piece forward so that it aligns it right to the edge of the tenon. And I typically just have to hold it for a few seconds, and it's set. And I did want to mention that if you're interested in getting plans for this project, I do have a complete set of 3D plans, which includes a materials list and everything, for you to build this. There's a link to that in the description below. And finally, we will move on to the very last piece. Same procedure here. I will glue it up so I make sure the glue will make contact with the blackwood to blackwood and on the shoulder of the tenon as well, and get it thoroughly coated there. And we'll put the glue into place. And it looks like a big mess and stuff like that, but it's not going to be hard to clean up at all. This CA glue just sands off really easy. And I can use this accelerator also, hold it down and spray some accelerator, and that will cause it to cure really fast. You know, it takes ordinarily just a few seconds anyway, but if I want an instant cure, then using the accelerator is the way to go. I can just take a random orbit sander with a little bit rougher grit. I think I have 80 grit or 100 grit on here at this point, and I'll just sand all of these edges down to flush. And once I've sanded it with, I think I did start with 80, then I'll probably put 100 or 120 on, and then I'll finish that up with about 150, and I'll let it go at that level until I'm ready to finish sand the whole piece. But you can see all that glue sanded right off and everything sanded down nice and smooth, and it's giving me the look that I want. And if this hung over the bottom a little bit too, we can just sand that down to flush as well. It's pretty simple to do. And I think that looks really good. You know, having a foot on the bottom of it, it's kind of a nice accent to the whole piece. And so we'll do that to the other 3 legs, and then we're going to jump onto the top. I want to put a 1/4 inch thick cap at the top, and that's what I'm getting ready to cut here. I'll do the same thing when I'm cutting this piece. Is I'll just cut it to be a little bit oversized, and I'll sand it down to flush with the post as soon as it's installed on the post. And you can see this one is going to matter. I have all the grain for all 4 of these running the same way. I thought that might look better in the end. Here we're just going to use CA glue as well, and I'm going to position it in such a way that I have just a tiny bit of overhang on all 4 sides, so I know when I sand it, it will sand down to perfectly flush. And once again, it looks like a big mess. Sometimes if you get CA running down the sides and you use the accelerator, it foams up, but it will sand off nicely. Since I'm sanding the end grain of the African Blackwood here, for sure I'm going to start with 80 grit. The end grain, at least on 2 of the sides, is so much harder, and this is a very, very hard species of wood. So we'll get everything sanded down flush with 80, then we'll move gradually up to 150, and that's what that's going to look like. Then the next thing I want to do is take this over to my vise, and I'm going to cut a small chamfer on the bottom of these feet. If this bed gets slid around in the room, I don't want the edges of this Blackwood to catch, because they had their edges sticking off a little bit. I don't want them to catch on something and potentially break off or chip off. I want it to stay looking good. I just anticipate some sort of movement might occur, and that chamfer is going to help that out. Once that's done, I also want to put a chamfer on the top cap all the way around. I think this just makes it look a little bit nicer. More glue! It's very hard to get them to laugh or smile on camera. I know we all look so serious when we're building, even though we're having a good time, so I have to yell out, make jokes, do all kinds of things to get them to laugh or smile. But as you can see, we are moving on to the assembly. Everything has all been cut and fitted, and now we're moving on to the final assembly of the main bed frame itself. And of course, we do want to make sure that the bed frame is square. It'd be unusual for mortise and tenons of this size to result in an unsquare system, but if it did, we'd want to fix that before moving on. Finally, I want to pin the tenons into their mortises by drilling all the way through the outside with a 1/2 inch drill and running some 1/2 inch walnut dowel through there. That's going to ensure that these mortise and tenons never come loose even in the future. We'll clean some of the excess glue off, and then I will trim this just a little bit above flush. And after that, we will let it dry a bit, and then I'll go ahead and sand that dowel pin down to flush. And it definitely goes a lot faster when you have a lot of hands in the shop and they're all working at once. I'd like to take a moment to say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. Without you guys, a lot of our projects wouldn't be possible. And if any of you are out there interested in supporting us on Patreon, I'll have a link to our Patreon page in the description down below as well. And I'd also like to say thank you to everybody who takes the time to buy the items that they need from the links in the descriptions of our videos. Those links let Amazon know that you came shopping from our website here, from our YouTube channel, and they give us a small percentage of the sale back as a commission, and that goes directly to our channel to help fund new projects. So thank you to everybody who does that. We really enjoy doing what we do, and without your help, this just wouldn't be possible. All right, so with the glue up all done and getting cleaned off, obviously there's plenty of time to joke around and take silly pictures. Okay, so this is what it looks like, and even though I do have all of these pinned, we're going to go ahead and let this set up overnight in the glue up before we continue. With the bed frame out of clamps, we will go ahead and sand all of the surfaces down to 180 grit. For the next part of the project, we're going to work on the slats. So we've already planed this board down, and now I'm just going to joint one edge, then we're going to take it over to the table saw, and we're going to rip out all the slats. You'll see in a lot of our projects, we always joint one edge before we take the board over to the table saw, and that's critically important. You can't rip a board on a table saw that doesn't have one perfectly straight edge. You have to run a table saw in conjunction with the fence if you're doing ripping, and you've got to have a straight edge to do that, or you create a dangerous situation that's going to involve kickback. Once the strips are ripped out, we're going to cross-cut all of the different slats to length. And the easiest way to do that is to have a stop, and that ensures that we have a consistent length for all of these. The slats are being held in on the top and on the bottom with a decorative trim piece, and we're actually going to hold everything with dowels, but it's sort of going to be a hidden dowel system. I'll show you how that works. But the first step is for us to take the slats, and I'm using an OG, a router bit shape here, and putting a decorative edge on both sides of each of these upper and lower pieces, which are going to hold the slats for us that are going to go around the perimeter of the bed. Now, of course, we have to sand these down, these profiles that we've just cut. There's a couple of ways to do that. This particular tool that I have is a hard rubber tool. I'll put a link to these things in the video below. But you see it's concave on one side and convex on the other, and that works for the two different profiles of this. And it's very easy. You put a piece of sandpaper over it, hold it in place, and it's easy to sand that. You see I'm sanding the convex portion here, and then we'll sand the concave portion in just a moment by flipping this little tool around and putting the sandpaper around there. And it makes quick work of sanding. So that's one good tool to get, and there are many options when it comes to tools. Another is this soft sander system, which I've talked about before. I've had the soft sander system for a long time, and I really like it. I'm not sponsored by any of these companies. These are just some of the tools that I use to make sanding these things, these profiles, very easy. And you get these profiles in a box of like 6 or 7 different profile shapes, and just makes it real easy to sand the edges of different shapes that come off of your router. And the main ones here, the hard ones, they come in a set of like 5 or 6 different sizes, and that's basically concave and convex. And then the soft sanders come in a variety of different shapes, and it comes in a box with these in here. It looks like there's 5 or 6, I think, of those in there. But I'll put links to those in the description if you think that might be something you would need or you're interested in looking at. Next, I'm going to cut the vertical slats themselves that go in between the two decorative portions that I've cut, and I have a slab here. So it's not really a slab. It was just a piece of walnut that we had with live edge on both sides. It wasn't very straight, and it was difficult for us to turn it into anything, and it was a pretty thin slab. I think it was just a tiny bit over 1 inch. So I'm just going to cross cut this down, take the bark off of it, and cut these up for pieces for the slats for the bed. Once again, of course, I have to have a perfectly straight edge before I can put an edge against my table saw fence and do any ripping. So in this case, it's easiest for me to just get a circular saw out and cut that straight edge to begin with. And I would recommend, if you can't follow a line perfectly with a circular saw, then it would be a good idea if you had a jointer to just run that edge over the jointer before you took it to the table saw. It just makes it a little bit safer there. So once that's cut, we're going to go ahead and cut the slats out themselves. You might be able to see that board has a little bit of wobble in it, but I don't want to flatten the entire board because I would just lose too much thickness. So I'm just going to cut these individual slats out first, and then I'll take the time to flatten and square up and thickness each slat down from there. That's going to save some wood in the long run for us. A great place to get a lot of boards like this is to check Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace. There's a lot of tree trimmers who do work and take down trees, and then they slice the wood into slabs themselves and then sell it for a really good price, sometimes a lot better than what you can get at a local hardwood dealer. So we always keep our eye out for things like that, and a little bit rough, and we've got to do some milling to it, but in the end it's just as good as anything you could have bought at a hardwood store. And so we just jointed one face to get it flat. We didn't have to waste much wood there because it was pretty narrow. And then we'll flip that over and we'll take it through the planer, and that'll flatten out the other side. I think it took a couple of passes each to get these things down to perfectly flat and square. And you might notice in this case we went from jointer to planer. We face jointed one face and then we went to the planer. After that, I have two faces, top and bottom, which are both parallel to each other. Then I'm going to go back to the jointer, and I'm going to joint the bottom side of this square. It's kind of important to go in that order for a piece that's totally rough, because that's the best way to do it, here again, while saving wood. So I've marked the side that I did not run on the jointer, and we're going to cut that side off parallel to the jointed side on the table saw. And if you follow a sequence like this, you'll be left with a piece of lumber that is perfectly square and has perfect 90-degree corners on all four sides, and both faces are parallel to each other and both sides are parallel to each other. So it's perfect stock to start working with. Then I've got my stop set up once again on my miter station, and I'm going to cut all of these slats down to their perfect length. Okay, so now it's time to get to some assembly. There's probably 100 ways to do an assembly like this. I'm just going to show you one. This is going to allow me to assemble these things with dowels. I'm going to dowel the vertical slats into these pieces, but I don't want the dowels to show, so you can follow along here and see how I do this. I also happen to think it's probably the easiest way to do it. So I've taken the top and bottom pieces, I'm going to clamp those in place, and then I've marked the center point on those top and bottom pieces, and I've also marked the center point on this vertical slat. That's where I'm going to start, right in the middle. I'm going to get those things all lined up, top and bottom, and then I'm just going to put a couple of drops of CA glue on the sides. This is a very thin CA glue, and it's just going to absorb or wick right into the wood, right between the grain. And I had to switch to one that had a different lid on it here to get it to wick in a little bit better. It's going to wick into the joint and just kind of freeze it right there and hold it still for me. And I'll sand off that little bit of darkness that's occurring there in a later step. Then I'll go ahead and I'll proceed to install these one at a time. I've cut myself a little spacer block that lets me know how far I want to go over each time for the next slat, and so on and so forth. And I'll just do the same thing. I'm going to wick some glue into the edges of this as well. This glue is really just holding this here temporarily until I can get dowels in. Once I have them all glued into place, I'll just very carefully pull this out of the joint where it was. And I know it fits perfectly because it was just in there as a test fit. And then I will clamp it together and I will drill down through the top and through the bottom. And I'll drill a pair of dowel holes in. That way I can put 2 dowels so this piece can't ever rotate if, should the glue come loose and on the dowel that's holding it in place for any reason. A pair of dowels high and a pair of dowels low. That'll lock it in solid and it will never rotate. We're going to drive the dowels down flush so that they're not sticking up above the top. And that way it's basically a hidden dowel fastener type system. And I didn't have to worry about any difficult alignment to begin with. I just put the boards in place, tacked them in, took it down, doweled them together, and it's really pretty fast. It doesn't take more than maybe 10 minutes to do a side if you do it like this. Then I'm going to go ahead and sand off that extra glue on the top once it's dry just a little bit, and to make sure that there's none of those dowels that are sticking up above the top. After that, I can just apply glue to the top and bottom rail here and slide this thing back in place. And I know now that the dowels are locked in securely. And so that's just one real quick, easy way to create a doweled system without any complicated layout. And it basically designed it and cut it to fit from the start. So I think it's a pretty easy way to assemble a structure like this. And we'll just continue like this around the perimeter of the bed, doing the same thing. And today one of my friends showed up, Sean Smithson. He is from Smithson Creations. He also has a YouTube channel. He's a newer channel and he's a newer woodworker, but he's learning fast and he does a good job, and we always appreciate it when he comes over to give us a hand. You guys should go check out his channel and subscribe to him and help his channel grow. After that, we'll clean off some of the glue that's squeezed out up top and down low. And we've got it clamped in tight everywhere. And then we'll go ahead and drill a dowel in through these upper and lower rails. We'll probably put one in each corner, and we'll just put a walnut dowel in there so it won't be very noticeable. And that will really lock this whole rail system in a lot stronger than if we just had glue by itself, although I suspect glue would probably hold. But I get a bunch of kids on there wrestling on the bed and kicking on these slats. I know they won't come out now. Not sure if you can hear it on video, but whenever you're hammering a dowel home, this dowel doesn't go all the way through, and it does have a definite bottom out, but you can hear a distinct pitch change when the dowel has bottomed out. The sound has changed quite a bit. Then we'll wipe off the excess glue. We'll do like we did before and trim the dowel flush there, and then I'll just sand that little bit of leftover dowel on top down flush with the surface of the wood, and that's not too noticeable, and that's going to be below the mattress at any rate, so I think that'll work out. Alright, so we're in the home stretch here, and this is cottonwood that I got at my local hardwood dealer. I bought this particular wood because it was just very cheap. It's inexpensive lumber, and I think it was on sale. They have a sale once a month where they put different species on sale, and we paid $1 something a board foot for this, so it was really cheap. And I'm going to use these for the slats. This is what's going to hold up the mattress for this daybed. So once we have all of those cut out, my daughter Covey is going to sand them all. We don't want to get any splinters from these things, so she'll sand, even though they're under the mattress, they still have to be handled. So she'll sand all those down, and we'll make sure we hit all of the corners and all of the sharp edges to make sure that it's perfectly smooth all the way around. Now we're going to need some sort of a rail to support those slats, and here's what we often do instead of grabbing a measuring tape is we'll just hold it in place and make a quick mark, especially if the fit isn't absolutely critical. And Covey and Cy are doing that here, and Maya is going to cut it on the chop saw for us. So as it turns out, these two pieces of wood are mahogany. They had mahogany on sale. They were like 2-inch by, or 8/4, I suppose, by about 2.5-inch wide strips of mahogany for really cheap. I think about $3 a strip on sale at Paxton Hardwoods. It was lumber that they had bought and ordered for somebody, and the person didn't use it, or this was excess. I'm not real sure, but being really narrow, it wasn't very saleable, and so we picked up a couple of boards of that for this. The species underneath here, I don't really think have to match because, you know, nobody's going to look underneath the mattress and see what you got going on there. So we've glued that in place, and I'm just checking the height to which we're going to put that rail on because I want the slat to fit in there perfectly and be flush with the walnut rail. And Maya and Covey are going to glue the back one on for us. Same thing, we'll apply a glue on there and they'll hold up in place and clamp that in place. So Covey keeps her nails like that so that if I need any wood chiseled, I don't have to walk all the way over to the drawer to pull chisels out. I think she could just chisel the wood for me herself. Once again, the altitude of the rail is important. We want to make sure that when the slat goes on top of it, it comes up flush with the top of the rail, and that's what they're doing as they're clamping that down there. And with the strength of adhesives these days, I have no doubt that it would hold thousands of pounds with just the glue joint alone. But just the same, I'd like to go ahead and put some 1/2-inch dowels in it anyway and beef it up, make it a little bit stronger, and you make it something that will last forever. I'm sure many of you probably use that tape trick to tell you how deep to drill with your drill so you don't accidentally poke through the other side. Once again, I just want to mention that if this is a project that you're thinking about doing and you're interested, I will have a full set of 3D plans and a materials list for this. And there'll be a link to that in the description below. Finally, we need to trim these all flush with the edge of the rail there, and then we'll sand them down so that we have a nice even finish on it. These are a little bit more visible than the walnut dowels. I just used a generic dowel here. I didn't bother with the expense of a mahogany dowel, but that's okay. It's underneath the bed, and I think it'll be just fine. We can go ahead and take these clamps off at this point. The glue's been sitting up for probably 30 or 45 minutes, and then with the dowels in there, it's not going to go anywhere. Once these are off, this will allow us to go ahead and do a final sand on the entire bed. And when we do our final sanding, typically I will take everything down, if I'm going to do lacquer anyway, I'll take everything down to about 180 grit. There's not really any need to go any smoother than that since lacquer is a film finish. It's going to provide its own surface. So the surface that you feel is the film of lacquer. So it wouldn't make any difference if we took it down to 220 or 300 or 400 or anything like that, because the smoothness that you ultimately feel is just the lacquer on top anyway. For bigger lacquer projects, we always use our HVLP spray gun. I've used different types in the past. I've used one that hooks up to a compressor. Since then, I've kind of moved on to an Apollo HVLP 4-stage system. It wastes a lot less material since there's very little overspray in these, and it's just very fast and efficient. You've seen many times when I do the mallets, I do them with a spray can, but obviously a project like this is just too big for that, and something like this Apollo just makes it perfect. Then with a quick twist of the tip, I can change the pattern of spray and so it goes sideways instead of vertically, and then I can spray up and down on the slats here. A good way to spray with an HVLP gun is to hold the spray down before you begin your spray and spray past the end before you stop. This kind of gives you a nice uniform, even coat. And I also prefer lacquer finish over many other finishes because lacquer's fast. It's a rock hard finish. It dries very, very fast. I can put on a second coat within 10 minutes, and I just love the finish. It's easy to repair if there are problems with it. And for me, it's just a go-to finish. And so Sai is going to spray the inside of the bed here for me. It's easy for her to reach since she can climb up on that assembly table. And she's demonstrating good spray technique here as well. She's going to start the spray before she begins making the pass over the wood and continue it until she's moved past the wood. Now Sai is putting down a very, very thin coat. That's why she's making 2 passes without allowing any dry time in between. So once we've applied 5 or 6 coats around the perimeter of the whole job, then we can take 600 or 800 grit sandpaper and go over the entire project very lightly once. This will knock down any fuzzies or hit any rough spots that might be there, and that will help so when we ultimately get to the very final coat, it just goes on glass smooth. When working with a very fine grit sandpaper, you have to change paper fairly frequently, but that's okay because we usually use pretty small pieces. When we're done at this stage, we will take a tack cloth and very lightly go over everything to pick up the excess dust. This dust is all lacquer dust, but that gets it clean and prepared for the final coat, which Sai has done for us on the whole bed. And now that everything is dried completely, we've put up a couple of drop cloths so we can try to take a photograph, and Maya is assembling the bed for us, putting all the slats in place. These are actually just going to float here. I don't think we're going to screw them down or attach them. And that concludes this project. If you made it all the way through to the very end here, thank you very much for watching. We really appreciate it.